Welcome back to The Report. In just over 2 weeks' time, Scottish voters go to the polls to deliver their verdict on whether they want to remain a part of the United Kingdom or become an independent nation. Opinion polls have consistently shown a lead for the no vote against breaking away from the Union. However, the gap between the two sides has dramatically narrowed in recent weeks. Nathaniel Amos Sansom has more.
With 2 weeks to go until the most important referendum in British history, the future of the United Kingdom hangs in the balance, and whatever the result, the outcome will affect the future direction of Britain's economy and society. Following the second and final debate between the leaders of the Yes and No campaigns, the polls have narrowed, as Yes campaign leader and Scottish First Minister Alex Salmond was seen by 70% of viewers to have won the debate over the Better Together leader, Alistair Darling. However, the Yes campaign has remained consistently behind in the polls over the last year, and there were still concerns from many people about the prospects of an independent Scotland.
Scotland already thrives by being part of the Union. We're part of one of the, and probably the most successful union of countries in the world. The Union of England, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland has lasted for 307 years. And we get the safety, security and stability of being part of the UK, as well as the strength of the UK wrapped around us.
Better Together has campaigned on the message that the Union offers stability and security for the people of Scotland and Scottish business. And while many economists and politicians have argued that independence would be detrimental to the Scottish economy, with roughly 60% of its trade currently occurring with the rest of the UK, many business owners also see the advantage of independence.
Well, it's a great opportunity because if you look at the numbers round about the strength of Scotland's economy, Scotland generates more tax per person than the rest of the UK. We've got higher gross domestic product per person than the rest of the UK. This is a wealthy country. The problem is that wealth doesn't stay here to get best use for the economy, the business and the people of Scotland. Independence gives us the opportunity to take control of that, set policies whereby we can grow the Scottish economy to realise its full potential.
Regardless of the result on the 18th of September, the independence debate has undoubtedly re-engaged many in Scottish society, who have not necessarily engaged in politics previously. While Scotland has a much smaller Muslim and ethnic minority population than the rest of the United Kingdom, a poll taken by the Scottish Asian radio station, Awaz FM, found that over 60% of its listeners were considering backing independence, perhaps showing that the SNP's more inclusive civic nationalism is winning over these groups.
Identity will play some part in this campaign, but not a huge part. And this is, you can be British, you can feel British, actually, and vote yes, because we're part of the British Isles. From a geographical perspective, from a cultural perspective, we will have a strong social union with a yes vote. That's all those years of history aren't just going to magically disappear. All this means is that Westminster does make decisions for Scotland, that our Parliament in Scotland makes decisions for Scotland.
Yet while the referendum hasn't captured the national imagination of the rest of the UK, many politicians are warning of grave consequences if the rest of the country ignores the debate.
Somehow, we don't realise that this is the single biggest political decision since the Second World War. Maybe the biggest political decision in our country for 300 years. It's a third of our country leaving. And a lot of people in Britain haven't woken up yet and still say, oh, it's a bit political, or it's a bit complicated, or it doesn't have anything to do with me, or it's up to the Scots. As though this wasn't what it is, which is an existential question for the whole of Britain. This is the United Kingdom about to be torn in pieces.
Nathaniel Amos Sansom, The Report, Islam Channel.
Well, joining me in the studio to discuss the referendum and the implications of a pro-independence vote is James Meadway, a Senior Economist at the New Economics Foundation. And on the line we have Jonathon Shafi, co-founder of the Radical Independence Campaign. Welcome to the show. Let me start with you, James. Alex Salmond says his first option is to continue with the pound. Now, let's say there is a pro-independence vote, a yes vote in 2 weeks' time, and there's a new reality. Do you think that the British government, the Cameron government, will refuse to negotiate on the basis of keeping the pound for Scotland?
Well, they can refuse all they like. There's very, very little plausibly they can do about it. As Alistair Darling himself said during the debate a couple of weeks ago, if Scotland wants to carry on using the pound, they can use the pound to independence. If you have a freely traded currency, and in particular if you have two economies that are so closely tied together as these two economies are, there's very little plausibly that the government, the Bank of England can do that can stop or prevent Scotland using the pound if it wishes to do so. The SNP, I think, have recognised this said that we will often negotiate over how, for example, banks will be regulated, what the share of the national debts will be after independence. But fundamentally, if they want to go alone and carry on using the pound, I don't believe there's anything the Bank of England or anybody in Westminster can do about that.
Do you think the Bank of England will refuse to let them work with them?
Well, they can try. You can run through a list of plausible sanctions should negotiations entirely break down. And I think, like Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, has said, that largely the argument about who gets to use a currency and we're going to refuse to let you to use it is essentially a bluff on the part of Westminster. There's very little plausibly they can do. The sanctions that the Bank of England might try and threaten against Scottish banks strike me as not really plausible. If they're still using the pound, the Bank of England is saying we're going to punish banks using the pound. What does that say about the credibility of any bank using the pound? Anything they try and implement north of the border post-independence, any sanctions they try and impose, any threat to remove lender of last resort status, immediately starts to undermine the credibility of the Bank of England in England and for English banks. So I just don't believe they have much space for manoeuvre in this one.
And in fact, British businessmen, English businessmen, if you like to put it like that, surely they want stability. They want the pound to remain if Scotland votes yes, don't they?
I suspect that will be the case. I mean, this is the SNP's line. There are other voices I know of in the independence campaign who are arguing that Scotland should in fact set up its own currency. Again, that could be a choice after independence. The main thing here is that the currency selection is not the big issue that has been talked up to be, I think, during the course of this debate. It's not that hard for a country that's already using one currency to carry on using that currency. Really, very, very little has to change here.
Well, Jonathon Shafi, you call yourself the radical independence campaign. Are you one of those who thinks that Scotland, if it were to vote independence, should not keep the pound but should develop its own currency?
We think that if we have our own currency, we'll have more control over the economy, and we would advocate an independent currency in Scotland. But it's also worth pointing out that we think that the currency issue is being used as a tool, as a political ploy to frighten and to raise panic amongst the population of Scotland, and to do so in order to pressurise people to vote no. And on that score, we have absolutely no truck with Westminster bully, and that's what it is. It's all of the mainstream parties in Westminster coming together in a coalition to say to the people of Scotland, don't dare move out of line. And interestingly, people in Scotland don't like being told that by parties who have failed them for several decades.
Well, what about the issue of minority voters? I mean, we heard in the VT that it seems that Asian Scottish voters or Scottish Asian voters are much more heavily pro-independence than the other people in Scotland. I mean, why do you think that is? Why would somebody from a minority background be more pro-independence than somebody else?
Well, I think there's a couple of issues here. I mean, first, that people understand, people realise that if you have economic decline, one way of rationalising that, if you are the government, is to scapegoat people, is to blame other people, and is to divide people on their racial background, on being an immigrant, and so on and so forth. So that's one thing that people understand. People understand that the Cameron government, but not just the Cameron government, the whole of the political system in Westminster, its trajectory on these kind of questions, on the questions of race, on the questions of multiculturalism, is going to the right. They understand that and they want to break from it. But I think it's a mistake to say that it's particularly higher amongst the Asian community. I mean, what we are saying and what we are finding is that actually what this comes down to is a question of class. People realise that they have been sold out for too long, been failed for too long, but they also realise that this is a referendum not about any particular party, and therefore it's exacerbated the idea that this can offer real change through a yes vote, but yes being a platform through which radical ideas, left-wing ideas, ideas which are becoming extremely popular, can be brought into reality.
When you say it's an issue of class, do you mean that people who are not so well off, not so privileged, are more likely to go for independence, you mean?
Well, there is a layer of people in the UK who have benefited from the economic crisis. I mean, in the last year alone, the richest people have seen their wealth grow by over 15%, while at the same time we're seeing an increased number of people, up to 1 million people relying in the last year on emergency food aid. And people who are struggling by, the majority of people who are bearing the brunt of Tory austerity have had enough. And they've had enough and have the possibility of expressing the rejection of these kind of policies coming from Westminster for a yes vote. And so in that sense, tied to the question of independence far more than nationalism, far more than patriotism, is this question of alternative and an alternative to the consensus, the new Liberal consensus that we've seen for a decade.
Okay. Thank you for that. Coming back to you, James Meadway, I mean, the comment that we heard Rory Stewart, the MP, saying that it's amazing how little attention is being paid to the referendum in England and Wales, and people just don't seem to be getting concerned about it one way or the other. Why do you think that is? I mean, as Stewart says, it is the potential breakup of the United Kingdom.
I think there's a question here. I suppose that for a while there's been a belief, and it's been encouraged by the media, London-based media, that really this wasn't a serious issue. The no vote was obviously going to fail. The Scottish nationalism, which is always shown, with the procession of kilts and tossing cabers and all the rest of it, is always shown as a bit of a joke, a bit of a comedy issue. Alex Salmond, not a serious figure. That's how he's presented down here, and I think to a large extent that's sunk in. What I find extraordinary, of course, is that if reports are to be believed, I mean, it was the front page of the Financial Times today, that Nicholas Macpherson, who is head of the Treasury, is the permanent secretary there, saying they simply have no contingency plans in the event of a yes vote. So I think there's this belief that had settled in for a large number of people that it simply wasn't a serious question. I think what's happened in the last few weeks, it very clearly is a serious question, and it's forcing the debate north and south of the border.
Well, do you think the Treasury should start in the next 2 weeks developing a contingency plan?
You'd hope that they have a contingency plan. I mean, you'd assume that these are people who are meant to take some responsibility for the nation's finances and all the rest of it. If they'd simply sat there and assumed that it wasn't going to be a serious question, therefore no plans are necessary, I find that an extraordinary thing. So my guess is they'll be working quite hard to think of what they might do in the event of a yes vote, how they might approach negotiations, because that's what they're going to have to do here. One way or the other, if the vote goes to yes, there's going to be a process of negotiation. The SNP's timetable is that this should take place over the next 2 years or so. That may be the timetable we end up with. It may not be. But they won't have any choice. The time for bluff will be over by then.
Didn't Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, say that the bank itself had contingency plans?
Well, good, if that's the case. Very good, if that's the case. Of course, the question is somewhat wider than what the Bank of England is going to do. There's the issue of the allocation, for instance, of North Sea oil revenues, the divisions that have to be made in how taxes are collected. All these things the Treasury has a responsibility for. The impacts of this on the rest of the country could be really very substantial, and certainly on the economy.
And what do you think, Jonathon Shafi? I mean, should people in the UK be concerned from their narrow point of view, if you like, about Scottish independence? Do you think it'll be bad for people living outside Scotland in Britain?
Well, part of the reason that we are campaigning for independence is because we want to promote the idea that it is possible to have an economy where you have a publicly funded and free for all NHS. It is possible to renationalise the Royal Mail, as is currently committed to, and a whole raft of other similar measures. Now, we want to promote the idea that, if we renationalise Royal Mail, then it makes the situation in England such that Royal Mail workers will demand the same of their own politicians. Why should it happen in Scotland and not in England? But what we want to say is that fundamental to this entire is the crisis of British institutions, regardless of where you live. We don't just say, for example, that Westminster lives on a different planet to the people of Scotland. Westminster lives on a different planet to many people living in London, which is why they bring in water cannons and so on and so forth. What we have to think about here is this is all being discussed through the crisis of British institutions. And the answer to that crisis, the solution to that, has to be one which works in the favour of ordinary people, which it hasn't done for so long. And that's why I think this contest is so exciting. And by the way, I would say that it now, in our view, looks like a yes vote is more than certainly a possibility here.
Well, on that note, optimistic note from your point of view, we'll have to end. That's all we have time for tonight's programme. I want to thank Jonathon Shafi and James Meadway for taking part, and thank you at home for watching. Do remember that you can follow us on Twitter @IslamChannel and use the hashtag #TheReport. We're back tomorrow evening at the same time. But for now, we'll leave you with some footage. It shows a group of young dancers bringing the traditions and folklore of Circassian culture and art back to life after performing 3 shows earlier this week at the International Academy Theatre in Amman in Jordan. One of the aims of the performance was to revive Circassian traditions by creating links between the younger and older generations. Good night.